After finding my stepson playing in his room, I decided to help him, an action that unexpectedly turned into an exciting experience I never imagined. It all started on a peaceful Sunday afternoon, with a strange quietness and a comforting sense of familiarity in the house. I had spent most of the day tidying up, immersing myself in small tasks to keep my mind occupied. The house was mostly empty as my husband had gone on an impromptu fishing trip with some friends, leaving the weekend unusually calm. Kyle was upstairs in his room, and I could faintly hear the bass of his music drifting down to the kitchen. It was rare for us to have the house to ourselves, but the relationship between Kyle and me had always been easy. Kyle was 22, and although he exuded the confidence that comes with his age, he also had a reserved side that would occasionally show. Over the years, I'd come to appreciate the quiet bond we shared. Subtle, not loud, but steady and comforting. After finishing the dishes, I poured myself a glass of iced tea and stood by the kitchen window, allowing the sunlight's warmth to wash over me. The stillness should have been soothing, but instead, an uneasy energy stirred inside me, the kind that made it hard to stay still. After a moment, I decided to check on Kyle's music, which was still playing softly. When I reached the top of the stairs, the door to his room was ajar, letting the sound escape. I hesitated briefly, wondering if I should knock or leave him in peace. However, an irresistible curiosity urged me forward, and as I got closer, preparing to call out to him, the sight through the small gap stopped me. Kyle was seated on the edge of his bed, his posture relaxed yet focused, his hands moving deliberately. I couldn't immediately understand what he was doing, as his eyes were fixed downward, his brow furrowed in concentration. My breath caught when I realized what he was up to. The intimate nature of the scene made me turn away, granting him the privacy I assumed he wanted, but I stood frozen, caught in a strange mix of astonishment and curiosity. The vulnerability of the moment, coupled with Kyle's apparent oblivion to the outside world, captivated me. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, casting gentle shadows that highlighted the lines of his face and the curve of his shoulders. I knew I shouldn't be watching him, yet seeing him so exposed and real sparked a deep curiosity in me, an unspoken question I couldn't ignore. Before I could process my thoughts, Kyle looked up, his eyes meeting mine through the narrow opening in the door. Time seemed to stop, and his expression shifted from surprise to a blend of embarrassment and uncertainty. His hands froze, and for a brief moment, neither of us moved, suspended in a shared silence that felt endless. I tried to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words didn't come. My heart raced in my chest, pounding in my ears. Kyle was the first to reach for a blanket nearby to cover himself, his cheeks turning red. "I didn't think you'd come upstairs," he murmured, his voice low and filled with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, feeling a rush of heat in my face as I backed away from the door. I didn't mean to intrude, but Kyle raised his hand gently, signaling for me to stop. "It's fine," he said quickly, though his voice trembled. "Just give me a minute." I nodded and retreated down the hall, standing at the top of the stairs, my thoughts swirling. I regretted lingering and watching, but the image of Kyle, so open and vulnerable, remained with me, impossible to forget. I stayed there, gripping the banister, trying to steady my breath as a flood of thoughts overwhelmed me. I had never seen Kyle like this before, not just in appearance, but emotionally too. There was something in his expression that struck me deeply, something I couldn't put into words. Little did I know, this would be the start of something unexpected. The sound of Kyle's door creaking open snapped me out of my daze. He stepped into the hall, moving cautiously, his eyes avoiding mine. He was dressed in a t-shirt and shorts, his usual laid-back clothes, but his flushed face and the tension in his body made it clear he was uncomfortable. "Sorry about that," he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "I didn't mean for you to see that." "It's okay," I replied quickly, my voice softer than usual. "I should have knocked. I wasn't thinking." He nodded, briefly meeting my gaze before looking away again. "I guess we're even now," he said with a nervous laugh. "Even?" I asked, tilting my head in confusion. He shrugged, a small smile appearing at the corner of his lips. "Remember last summer, when you forgot to lock the bathroom?" The memory hit me suddenly, making my cheeks flush with new embarrassment. I had completely forgotten about that moment, the brief awkwardness we had brushed off at the time. "I suppose you're right," I said with a laugh, though I still felt a hint of nervousness. "We are even." The tension between us eased a bit, the shared memory helping bridge the awkwardness. Still, even as we laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, an unspoken tension that lingered just beneath the surface. The laughter faded, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt different from our usual easy moments. Kyle leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, but his posture was tense, uncertain. I thought about retreating downstairs to give him space, but the way his gaze flickered toward me, both hesitant and searching, made me stay. It wasn't discomfort. It was something gentler, almost vulnerable that kept me there. Finally, I spoke, my voice softer than I intended. Do you want to talk about it? Kyle's eyes widened slightly and his cheeks reddened as he shifted on his feet. Talk about what? He asked, his tone mixed with nervous humor. I offered a faint smile, hoping to ease the tension. Anything. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I thought it might help. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor as he rubbed the back of his neck. I don't know, he admitted after a pause. It's kind of embarrassing. I stepped closer, moving carefully like approaching something fragile. Kyle, it's okay to feel embarrassed. Everyone goes through it. His lips curled into a small, self-deprecating smile. Not everyone is caught by their stepmother, he said, half joking, half embarrassed. His words made me laugh softly, and to my surprise, his smile widened slightly in response. I suppose not, I agreed. I moved opposite him to lean against the wall, mirroring his posture. But if it helps, I've had plenty of awkward moments too. You're not alone. Kyle looked at me, his expression softening. Yeah, but you always seem so composed. Like you have everything under control. His words surprised me, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something unspoken. I'm not as composed as you think, I replied, my voice quieter now. I've had my share of uncertain moments. He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, trying to reconcile his view of me with what he was seeing. It's just weird, he said finally, his tone thoughtful. You're so different from Dad. Not in a bad way, just different. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I chose a gentler reply. Different can be good sometimes. Kyle nodded, still deep in thought. Yeah, he said after a pause. The stillness between us returned, but this time, it felt lighter. I noticed the tension in Kyle's shoulders easing, and the lines of concern around his eyes softening as he relaxed against the doorframe. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said after a moment, his voice turning more sincere. I wasn't really thinking. I forgot you were home. I assured him it was fine, wanting to make him feel better. It's okay. It wasn't a big deal. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. Kyle nodded, but he kept looking away. I'm fine, he said, though his voice still carried a hint of uncertainty. It's just hard for me to express what I'm feeling sometimes. His words hit me harder than I expected, stirring a deep empathy. Kyle, I said gently, moving closer, you don't have to be anything other than yourself. You don't need to meet anyone's expectations, mine, Dad's, or anyone else's. His eyes widened, searching mine, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. Do you really think that? He asked, his voice filled with doubt. I nodded firmly. You're a good person, Kyle. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and I noticed the tension in his body easing further. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You're welcome, I replied quietly. We stood in silence for a moment, and I noticed a faint smile lingering on Kyle's lips. A sense of relief washed over me, knowing that he seemed to be doing better. Still, even as the tension lifted, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed. His gaze lingered a little too long, and my heart fluttered unexpectedly. Finally, Kyle straightened up, pushing himself away from the doorframe with a quiet sigh. I should get going, he said, his tone light but still unsure. Take your time, I replied with a small smile. There's no rush. He nodded, our eyes meeting briefly before he retreated into his room, closing the door gently behind him. I lingered for a moment, staring at the closed door, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what I was feeling, maybe confusion or curiosity, but I knew that my relationship with Kyle had changed in a way I couldn't fully understand. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange haze as I occupied myself with small tasks like folding laundry and sorting through mail, trying to distract myself from the encounter. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of Kyle's expression and the vulnerability in his voice. It lingered in my mind like an unavoidable shadow. I reassured myself that this was just a temporary moment of awkwardness we would both get past. But the more I tried to convince myself, the less I believed it. There was something in the way he looked at me, so open, so vulnerable, that stirred deep emotions within me. By evening, I felt emotionally drained and settled on the couch with a book, hoping to escape my swirling thoughts in a fictional world. but the words on the pages blurred together and my attention kept drifting to the closed door at the top of the stairs. Then, the sound of footsteps broke my train of thought, and I looked up to see Kay coming down the stairs. His hair was slightly messy, as though he'd been lying in bed, and he carried an air of uncertainty that made my chest tighten. He spoke quietly, pausing at the bottom of the stairs, and said, "I was going to make some tea." The simplicity of his question caught me off guard, but I nodded immediately, not wanting to overthink it. That would be nice, thank you." Kyle walked into the kitchen, and after a moment's hesitation, I followed, unable to resist being near him. When I entered the kitchen, I found him already filling the kettle, his movements calm and purposeful. The soft hum of the boiling water filled the room, mixing with the quiet clink of cups as he set them on the counter. "Do you still prefer honey in yours?" he asked, glancing back at me. "Yes, please," I replied, leaning against the counter, watching him. His tone was casual, but I noticed the subtle precision in his actions, as though he were trying to distract himself. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound between us being the kettle. I wanted to say something to ease the tension that had been hanging between us since earlier, but the words escaped me. When the tea was ready, Kay handed me a cup and leaned against the counter opposite me. He took a small sip, his gaze focused on the steam rising from the cup. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice steady but firm. I tilted my head slightly, waiting for him to elaborate on the idea of not needing to meet others' expectations. He continued, explaining that he had spent so much time trying to please others that he had lost sight of his own dreams. His words hit me deeply, and I set my mug down carefully, worried my trembling hands might betray my inner turmoil. "Kyle," I said gently, "it's okay to feel uncertain. This approach allows you to keep exploring your options. You don't need to have all the answers right away." He seemed to understand, and his eyes met mine, but then he said, "What if I'm afraid of what I'll find? What if I don't like what I discover?" The raw honesty in his voice tightened my throat, and I took a deep breath before responding. "It's okay to be scared," I said, my voice shaky. "But you're stronger than you think. You don't have to face everything all at once. Take it one step at a time, and trust that you'll find your way." Kyle gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You make it sound so easy," he said. I acknowledged with a wistful smile, "It's not, but you're not alone. I'm here for you no matter what." For a moment, he just stared at me, his gaze unwavering. The vulnerability in his expression was almost too much to bear, and a strange, intense pull gripped my chest. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to thank me," I replied softly. "That's what family's for." Kyle nodded, but his face remained thoughtful, as if he was about to say something more. I gave him space to speak, but the moment passed, and he took another sip of his tea. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with unspoken words and emotions neither of us was ready to address. I wanted to offer him some comfort, but I didn't know what he needed, or if he even knew himself. Finally, Kay stood up, setting his cup on the counter. "I think I'm going to bed," he said, his tone light but tinged with hesitation. "Okay," I replied, my voice quieter than I meant. "Good night, Kyle." "Good night," he responded, his gaze lingering on me for just a moment before he turned and headed upstairs. I stood in the kitchen for a long while after he left, my thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and longing. The weight of the day pressed down on me, and I felt a mix of emotions, concern, tenderness, and something deeper that I couldn't name. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between Kyle and me. Something unspoken, yet undeniable. No matter how much I tried to push it away, I knew it would only grow stronger over time. But that wasn't the end of the story. No, the climax was still to come. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now. The air seemed heavier, as if the unspoken words between Kyle and me had seeped into the walls, lingering in every corner. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the soft rustle of the trees outside doing little to calm the restlessness inside me. My thoughts kept returning to Kyle. His expression, the vulnerability in his voice, the way his eyes lingered on mine just a moment too long. There was something there. Something I couldn't quite put into words, but it was undeniable. I rolled onto my side, closing my eyes in a futile attempt to fall asleep. But the silence only amplified my thoughts. After what felt like hours, I gave up. The stillness was suffocating, and I needed to move, to do something to shake the restless energy from my body. Slipping out of bed, I quietly padded down the hallway. The soft glow of the moonlight spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the walls. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward Kyle's room. His door was slightly ajar, enough for me to see the faint glow of a lamp spilling into the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, debating whether to knock. But before I could decide, I heard his voice, soft, almost hesitant. You can come in," he said, calm yet unsure. Swallowing hard, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Kyle was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands loosely clasped in his lap. His hair was a little messy, and the faint shadows under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping either. I noticed he was sitting the same way as the last time I entered his room, but this time, it seemed we both didn't care that we couldn't sleep. "Can't sleep?" I asked softly, leaning against the doorframe. He shook his head, offering a small, tired smile. "Too much on my mind, I guess." I nodded, understanding. "Me too." A moment passed in silence before Kyle spoke again, his voice breaking the quiet. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about not needing to meet anyone's expectations." I moved further into the room and closed the door behind me. "What about it?" I asked. Kyle hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It's just hard to believe sometimes. I feel like I've spent my whole life trying to be what others want me to be, and I don't know how to stop." His words hit me like a wave, and I crossed the room to sit beside him on the bed. "Kyle," I said softly, placing a hand on his arm, "you don't have to figure it all out right now. It's okay to take things one step at a time." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of uncertainty and something deeper, something that made my heart skip a beat. "What if I don't even know who I am without all of that?" he whispered. I squeezed his arm gently, feeling my own emotions swirling as I tried to find the right words. "You're still you, Kyle. The expectations don't define you. You're more than that, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Kyle's gaze lingered on mine, and I could feel the weight of his emotions in the air between us. "You make it sound so simple," he said, a faint, wistful smile curving his lips. "It's not," I admitted quietly. "But that doesn't mean it's impossible. You're stronger than you think." We fell silent again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the soft hum of the lamp casting a gentle glow over the room. It felt as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving just the two of us in this shared moment. "Thank you," Kyle finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "There's no need to thank me," I responded, my voice gentle but steady. As the tension lifted, I couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered on me or how my heart raced in response. There was something unsaid between us, something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to address. He shifted slightly, his hand brushing against mine as he adjusted his position. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a chill through me, my breath catching in my throat. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he murmured softly, his eyes dropping to our hands, where they rested together. "You'll never have to find out," I replied, my voice wavering just a bit. Kyle raised his gaze to mine, his eyes searching for something I couldn't quite identify. The air in the room felt impossibly still, charged with an energy that was both thrilling and frightening. In that moment, I knew things between us would never be the same. His gaze stayed fixed on mine, steady and searching, and I could feel the weight of it all, each beat of my heart ringing loud in my ears as the moment stretched on. I should have looked away, should have said something to break the silence and return us to the comfortable familiarity we had always known, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the intensity of his look and the vulnerability I saw in it. Kyle moved slightly, his hand brushing mine again. This time, neither of us pulled away. The contact was electric, sending a shiver down my spine, and I felt my skin tingle. My breath caught again, and a warmth bloomed in my chest that I couldn't ignore. "You've always been there for me," Kyle said quietly, his voice low and thick with emotion. "Even when I didn't know how to ask for help. I don't think I've ever told you how much that means to me." His words washed over me like a powerful tide, and I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. "Kyle," I said, my voice trembling just a bit, "you don't have to say that. You've always been important to me. I just want you to be happy." He gave a small, bittersweet smile. "I don't know what happiness looks like for me yet," he admitted, his gaze dropping to where our hands rested, fingers barely brushing. "But I know that when I'm around you, I feel like I can figure it out." The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache, and I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But as I opened my mouth to speak, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached out, my fingers gently curling around his hand. Kyle looked up at me then, his eyes wide, filled with something I couldn't name. I don't want to mess this up, he whispered softly. You're not going to mess anything up, I replied, my voice soft and steady now. Let me help you with what you were busy with. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us felt heavy and charged. Then, slowly, Kyle leaned in, his movements hesitant, almost unsure, as if waiting for me to stop him. I didn't. His lips met mine tentatively, and my heart fluttered. The kiss was gentle, almost uncertain, but it spread a warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. My hands moved instinctively, one resting on his arm, the other cupping his face, my fingers brushing against the faint stubble on his jaw. For a moment, the rest of the world seemed to vanish. There was no sound, no light, no time, just the warmth of his lips against mine, the steady beat of my heart, and the overwhelming sense of connection between us. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads resting together, a rush of emotions overwhelmed me. Confusion, yes, and fear, but also a deep, undeniable sense of something bright and hopeful that I couldn't explain. I had helped him, and I could see that he appreciated it, but still, I felt a sense of regret. Kyle, I began, my voice barely a whisper. I know, he said quickly, his voice trembling just a bit. I know it's complicated. I just needed you to know how I feel. My chest tightened at his words, and I exhaled shakily, my hands still resting on his arms. This isn't something we can take lightly, I said softly, my voice steady, despite the storm of emotions within me. I'm not, he replied earnestly. I've thought about this a lot. I've tried to ignore it, to push it away, but I can't. You're the one person who makes me feel like I can be myself. His honesty broke my heart, but also gave me comfort. I felt a pang of guilt for the feelings stirring inside me. This was new and unfamiliar, and I didn't know how to handle it. But as I looked into his eyes, it became clear that I couldn't ignore what was happening between us. I care about you, Kyle, I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. More than you probably realize. But we need to be careful. We need to think about what this means. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. I just don't want to lose this. Whatever this is, he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. It doesn't have to, I replied softly, my hands falling to my lap. But we have to take it slow. We have to be sure. Kyle nodded again, his face a mix of determination and vulnerability. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, he said quietly. The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache, and I offered him a small, tentative smile. We'll figure it out, I said, my voice steady. Together. Kyle smiled faintly, and for the first time that evening, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The tension in the room seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding. Things wouldn't be simple, but we would face them together. As I stood to leave, Kyle reached out, his fingers brushing against mine in a silent gesture of connection. I looked back at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully name, and I squeezed his hand gently before stepping into the hallway. It felt quieter now, and the weight in the air seemed to have lifted. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as I made my way back to my room, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't expected. Whatever came next, we would face it together. What do you think of what I did? Is it normal for a stepmother to help her stepson like that, or is it wrong? Let me know in the comments, please. Thank you.